They mocked her accent before even checking her name. At JFK International Airport, in full view of dozens of passengers, a poised older black woman stepped forward to check into her first-class flight. But instead of a warm welcome, she was met with smirks and sarcasm. "That's a strong Southern drawl," the airport agent said with a sneer, scanning her ID like it was a fake. Moments later, her seat was downgraded. Not a word of apology, just a blank screen and a cold, "You've been moved to economy." The woman, Marjgery Reed, CEO of Reed Global Travel, a $950 million multinational booking empire. The airport agent didn't bother to learn her name, didn't care who she was, thought she could be laughed at, dismissed, humiliated. But by the time that plane took off, the entire terminal had erupted in confusion. Within hours, boardrooms across JFK and ATL were in full crisis mode. Within 24 hours, Reed Global had canceled every partnership and rerouted every VIP, all because of one mocking smile. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. The glass facade of JFK's terminal caught the early morning light like a polished mirror, casting long shadows across the marble floors. Business people hustled families, corralled children, and airline staff darted between counters, all wrapped in the sterile rhythm of travel. But among them, one figure moved with unusual calm: Marjgery Reed, age 57, founder and CEO of Reed Global Travel. She didn't need a bodyguard. She didn't flaunt a designer logo. But the weight she carried wasn't made of metal or status. It was the gravity of quiet authority. Wrapped in a navy wool coat, a cream silk scarf elegantly tied at her neck, she rolled behind her an old leather suitcase scuffed from thousands of miles. Unlike the crisp suitcases of the new elite, hers was worn by time and triumph. The handle molded perfectly to her grip, like a weapon forged by decades of storms. To most eyes, she was just another black woman traveling alone, soft-spoken, well-dressed, with hair pulled into a tidy silver bun. But to those who knew she was the architect behind one of the most lucrative VIP travel networks in the world, with clients ranging from Fortune 100 CEOs to heads of state, Reed Global Travel wasn't just a booking company. It was the silent engine behind thousands of high-value charter routes, luxury events, and global hospitality networks. She had just flown in from Sao Paulo. Despite the overnight haul, she was composed. Her eyes scanned the flickering departure board with quiet calculation. Everything had already been cross-verified: 3 times her seat, her meal selection, the vehicle waiting at San Francisco Airport. That's how she operated: flawless logistics backed by iron routine. Not because she was obsessive, but because she'd learned from a lifetime of dismissals and second guesses that black women didn't get the luxury of mistakes. Her ticket was for seat 2A, first class, nonstop to San Francisco. A cabin she'd paid for, earned, and occupied without apology. Yet as she approached the check-in counter, something shifted. Behind the desk stood Tanya Bennett, a woman in her early 30s, blonde hair pinned into a tight top knot. Her uniform was spotless. Her name tag gleamed, but her eyes betrayed her. There was no recognition in them, just disinterest, irritation, superiority. "Next," Tanya said, not looking up. Marjgery stepped forward. "Good morning. I'm here to check in for my connecting flight. First class seat 2A. Here are my documents." Tanya's eyes flicked upward briefly, then down again, this time slower, scanning the ID and the boarding pass with exaggerated slowness. She tapped the keyboard, sighed, and smirked. "You've got quite an accent, ma'am." Georgia, Alabama. There was something in her voice, thinly veiled contempt, sharpened by condescension. "Yes," Georgia Marjgery replied evenly. Now based in Los Angeles. Tanya didn't hide the smirk that followed. She leaned into her monitor, tapped something quickly, then turned it away from view. Looks like there's been a seat change. You've been reassigned to economy, seat 34C." The words landed like a slap. "Excuse me," Marjgery asked, her voice still calm. "These things happen," Tanya replied with a shrug far too loudly. "Sometimes the system flags something and auto-adjusts. We can't override it once the reassignment goes through. Passengers in line began to shift. A few looked up curious. Others smirked amused. Marjorie remained composed. I have confirmation emails, she said, pulling up her phone. Booking code seat assignment, payment verification, everything is correct. Tanya didn't even look. I'm sure it's all very official, but if the system changed it, it changed it. She leaned closer, dropping her voice to a mock whisper. You might want to double check next time before booking such expensive seats. Her tone carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken judgments. Too old, too black, too soft-spoken, definitely not first class. As Tanya looked past her to the next passenger in line, a white man in flip-flops and a hoodie holding a crumpled paper ticket, her voice changed. Welcome, Mr. Drayton. First class right this way. No ID check, no verification, no suspicion. Marjorie didn't flinch, but something inside her began to settle. Not anger, not even outrage. Resolution, a quiet thread of steel unfurling within her. She had built her company on the foundation of logistics, partnerships, and power no one could see. She had watched boardrooms bend to her silence. And now standing before a gatekeeper who had no idea whose access she just denied, Marjgery Reed knew the next move would not be loud. It would be final. The murmur of movement behind her did not stop. The shuffle of luggage wheels, the sighs of impatient travelers, the mechanical rhythm of boarding announcements continued as if nothing had just occurred. But to Marjgery Reed, everything had changed. Her boarding pass, still warm from Tanya's dismissive fingers, was now marked 34C, economy, a seat that reeked not just of misclassification, but intention. She looked at it once more, not in disbelief, but to mentally photograph the evidence. Seat number, timestamp, agent name. She had done this before, not the being dismissed. The documentation. Tanya's smug voice snapped through the air. Next, please, already smiling broadly for the young man in flip-flops, she waved through like royalty, no questions asked. Her body language shifted as she leaned forward with a fake giggle, brushing off any memory of the older black woman still standing silently at the counter. But Marjgery didn't move. Is there a manager I may speak to? She asked, her tone even polite but firm. Tanya paused mid-hand gesture. Her smile twitched. There's no point, ma'am, she said with a sigh. The system won't allow changes now. Then, as if on cue, she tapped her radio, making sure her words were loud enough for those nearby to hear. Grant, yeah, we've got a passenger here. You'd asking about her upgrade. Says she's first class, but system says otherwise. The implication hung in the air. One passenger in a rumpled t-shirt breezed through without even verifying his ticket. But a composed black woman in a tailored coat needed a second check. And even then she was considered suspect. Minutes later, Grant Miller arrived, a man in his 40s with the stiff demeanor of someone whose professionalism had calcified into emotional vacancy. His gray suit was crisp, his tie nodded to regulation. But his eyes, they never once met hers directly. Can I help? He asked curtly. I've been reassigned to economy, Marjorie said calmly, presenting both her physical and digital documentation. This is my booking confirmation. First class, seat 2A, nonstop. Grant skimmed the phone, flicked through his clipboard, and shrugged. The system's final, he said, not offering so much as a pause for consideration. Sometimes auto adjustments happen. We can't override it. Behind his words was a practiced indifference, a lifetime of dodging complaints with protocol, of relying on the system to make discrimination look like a glitch. Marjorie felt her grip on the suitcase tighten. I'd like the name of your supervisor, she said evenly. Grant raised his eyebrow, but didn't protest. You can wait in the lounge. Someone will reach out when they're available. It was the verbal equivalent of a velvet rope across her path. Courteous, professional, and entirely designed to stall her, to send her away until her presence could be absorbed and forgotten. Behind her, someone muttered, just let her go already. A woman tugged her son's suitcase and rolled her eyes. Always some old lady holding up the line. But one pair of eyes didn't turn away. At the back of the line, a young black student, his hoodie tucked up and earbuds pulled loose, watched with quiet rage in his eyes. He didn't speak, but he saw every microaggression, every decision. Meanwhile, Tanya stood back at the keyboard, her grin curling like smoke as she typed into the internal chat. She's still standing there, LOL. Drama queen alert. Thinks she'll file a complaint. Bet she sues. Already gave her the downgrade treatment. Let her stew. 2 counters down. Megan Hayes, barely 22, and already soaked in institutional culture, giggled as the text popped up in her internal work chat. She nudged Chuck Evans, a crusty 50-something who'd been in the system too long to care anymore. Chuck chuckled, leaned in and whispered, "She's not exactly VIP material, huh? Let's hope she doesn't croak before we board her." They both laughed quietly. No one stopped them. Because in places like this, prejudice doesn't shout. It whispers, coded in camouflage, dressed up as protocol and company policy. Still, Marjgery did not flinch. She stepped away from the counter, not in defeat but in deliberation. She passed by the rows of indifferent passengers, the blaring gate announcements, and the smiling families. Her pace was slow, intentional. She stopped at the passenger support kiosk, where a young woman with a headset barely glanced up before saying, "Please wait to the side." She waited. 10 minutes. Then 15. Every smile she received was empty. Every glance skated past her like she was invisible. But she documented it all, every minute, every interaction, every name tag, every time someone refused to acknowledge her presence. She wasn't just collecting evidence for a complaint. She was building a case not against a single employee, but against an entire culture. A structure that defaulted to suspicion the moment a powerful black woman didn't fit the image of their ideal customer. She didn't need rage. She didn't need noise. She had her silence, and they had no idea what it was about to cost them. As she waited beside the glass barrier of the terminal lounge, Marjgery Reed remained perfectly still. Her eyes followed the mechanical rhythm of the escalators, the flickering departure board, and the tidy chaos of travelers weaving through security lines. But inside, she was archiving everything. 15 minutes, no update. 20, still no manager. Around her gate, agents buzzed through conversations, a chorus of clipped syllables and programmed smiles. But none of them turned toward her. Not a glance, not a question. As though she'd vanished from their registry altogether. Marjorie knew this silence intimately. It was the kind systems use when they don't want to be accountable. Not overtly hostile, but cold bureaucratic. Erasure by process. Across the waiting area, Megan Hayes leaned back in her swivel chair, casually checking her phone beneath the counter. Her thumbs moved quickly as she sent another message to the internal chat group. "Old lady's still here, won't quit LOL. Bet she writes Yelp reviews in cursive." Chuck replied, "Ha. Want me to offer her a complimentary apple juice and a pat on the head," Tanya chimed in. "Careful. Might sue you for that too." A sticker of an exploding emoji followed. They laughed, not loudly but loud enough for those who shared their worldview. Those who'd long mistaken customer service as a game of gatekeeping, not guardianship. Meanwhile, Marjgery stood alone. Her fingers brushed the smooth handle of her suitcase. That suitcase had been with her from the early days of Reed Global, back when she'd booked travel packages by hand and hand-delivered itineraries to corporate offices. She wasn't here by luck. She wasn't here for luxury. She was here because she had earned this seat. Her phone buzzed. A message from her assistant in Los Angeles preliminary monitoring picked up discriminatory language from JFK IP range. "Shall we start logging?" She replied with one word, "Yes." And then she walked shoulders upright, chin level to the customer escalation desk. A glass-paneled enclave tucked near the center of the terminal where problems are meant to disappear in a maze of forms and hold music. The woman behind the counter, a sharp-faced attendant with a script memorized too well, greeted her with a hollow smile. "Good morning. How can I help you today? I'm here regarding a first-class seat I booked." "Seat 2A. I've been downgraded, no explanation given. I've already provided documentation to 2 agents and I've been waiting over 30 minutes for someone with authority." The agent tapped on her keyboard with the enthusiasm of someone clocking out in 20 minutes. Her eyes flicked over the screen, then returned to Marjorie with a practiced look of apology. "I see your file here. Unfortunately, the record now shows seat 34C confirmed. Our system doesn't indicate any error. I suggest rechecking with your original booking platform." Marjorie's tone did not rise. "My platform was Reed Global. I own it." A beat of silence passed. The agent blinked, then continued typing, pretending not to have heard. Marjorie leaned in slightly. "Please log my formal objection and print me a time-stamped copy of this conversation." "I'm afraid we're not authorized to give copies of internal logs, ma'am." "I see." She took a breath, then added softly, "You are now part of this record." Just then, Chuck Evans sauntered over to the boarding desk. He paused, eyed Marjgery, and snorted. "Still causing a fuss, huh?" he muttered under his breath, just loud enough to be heard, but quiet enough to deny later. She turned to him slowly. "No, just asking for what I paid for. That's not fuss. That's called a receipt." He chuckled and walked away. At that moment, Marjgery's phone buzzed again. Screenshot attached. Agent message. "Old gal is gonna pop off." Logged under Megan H. She saved the file. One by one, every insult was being collected. She walked back to the lounge. Her suitcase rolled behind her like a loyal shadow. Inside, she took a seat by the corner window, placing her documents in neat stacks on the low table. Passengers moved around her, laughing, chatting, tapping on tablets. But she sat in complete silence, typing into a folder labeled Incident, JFK, Terminal 4, agent names, time-stamped remarks, tone inflection, sequence of events, every microaggression, every refusal to act, every piece of passive prejudice wrapped in protocol. This wasn't new. This wasn't even surprising. But today, for once, they were targeting the wrong person. The emails would go out soon. The protocols would activate. And by the time these agents realized who they had dismissed, their petty cruelty would cost them millions. Marjgery Reed did not need a scene. She needed precision. And now she had it. From her corner seat in the lounge, Marjgery Reed looked out over the terminal with a composure only decades of grit could foster. Around her, the cold glass white steel beams and brushed aluminum furniture screamed modernity, but the culture behind it remained primitive. The systems had evolved. The mindsets had not. Her phone buzzed again. Another screenshot. Another mocking message from the internal chat thread. "She's just sitting there collecting imaginary receipts," followed by a string of laughing emojis and the phrase, "Reed needs to take a seat in the retirement zone." Marjorie didn't blink. Instead, she uploaded the evidence to the legal folder marked Phase 1, Internal Culture. That's when it happened. Not an announcement, not a grand gesture, just a man standing up, Jason Patel. He was dressed in a trim navy suit, the kind favored by West Coast execs who balance comfort with quiet influence. He'd been watching, not staring, but observing, sharp-eyed, calculating. A venture capitalist in his early 40s, Jason had flown first class on the same routes Marjorie built her empire navigating. He wasn't loud. He wasn't aggressive. But when he walked over to the counter where Megan Hayes was now stationed, his voice carried through the sterile hush of the lounge like a courtroom gavel. "Excuse me," he said, placing a business card on the desk, "but I've been watching everything since the moment Ms. Reed was turned away." Megan froze mid-scroll on her phone. Jason pointed toward Marjorie. "She had a first-class ticket. Seat 2A. I saw it. I saw her show it. I saw Tanya ignore her. I saw Grant dismiss her. I saw your chat messages. Don't pretend this didn't happen." Megan's forced smile cracked. Sir, we're not authorized to discuss another passenger's itinerary. It violates privacy. Jason interjected, his voice steel beneath silk. You shouted her seat downgrade across the terminal. You mocked her accent. You treated her like a criminal. Passengers began to look up. The quiet hum of phones and coffee orders gave way to tension. You made this public. Jason continued, so don't invoke privacy now to cover your tracks. Chuck Evans nearby stood up and crossed his arms. Sir, I suggest you lower your voice. Jason didn't move. I suggest you remember that security footage has audio. Behind the counter, Megan paled. She glanced at her terminal and hastily began typing. At that moment, Ron Wallace emerged from a side hallway, calm, clipped, and clearly summoned. Mr. Patel, he said tone flat, if you are not directly involved in a dispute, I must ask you to return to your seat. Please do not interfere with our staff's ability to manage passengers. Jason met his gaze. You mean manage them out of sight? Sir, I've documented everything Jason said firmly, and I'm not the only one. Ron blinked. For a second, the system hesitated, and that was all it took. Jason turned toward Marjgery and gave her a slight nod, respectful, deliberate. It wasn't grand, but it was public, visible, and unignorable. Marjgery returned it with a small, measured tilt of her head. Her eyes didn't soften, but they glinted with a spark of recognition. The wall had cracked, and the system had blinked. Ron signaled Paul and Jimmy, two security guards standing like silent bookends in the boarding area, to form a perimeter. Not for violence, just for control, because now the story was growing teeth. Jason didn't resist. He returned to his seat, but the echo of his words lingered like smoke after a firecracker. Passengers whispered. Some glanced over at Ms. Reed, then quickly away. Others adjusted their earbuds. Most did nothing. But a few now saw, really saw. Karen Smith, watching the interaction from the far end of the counter, muttered under her breath, that man just turned a delay into a PR mess. Tanya, reading the chat on her terminal, typed quickly, did Jason just go full corporate whistleblower LOL? He's going to regret this when we mark his account. But even as they joked, their fingers typed slower, less confident, less cruel. Because Jason had shifted something. Not the outcome, not yet, but the energy. And Marjgery Reed, from her seat near the far wall, began drafting the next sequence. Marjgery Reed stood amidst the rush of boarding passengers, one hand gripping the worn leather handle of her suitcase, the other clutching her boarding pass clearly printed with first class. Seat 2A. The crowd flowed around her like water around stone. Loudspeakers echoed boarding announcements. No one stopped. No one noticed. And yet she remained still, as if rooted to the spot. Behind her calm exterior, a quiet storm was forming. Tanya Bennett had stepped away from the check-in desk, her smug smirk still burning in memory. But the damage wasn't just in the smirk, it was in what followed. Nothing. No one intervened. No voice rose to question. Not a single traveler stepped up. Not because they didn't notice, but because looking away had become a habit. Now a new staff member had taken Tanya's place. Megan Hayes, barely in her 20s with bright red hair, pulled into a high ponytail and a forced air of professionalism. She didn't look at Marjgery even once. Her fingers clacked across the keyboard as she called the next guest, as though Marjgery Reed didn't exist at all. A middle-aged man in the line sighed and muttered to his wife, "It's always some old lady holding everything up." A young blonde woman tugged her suitcase across Marjgery's foot without an apology. Farther back, a young black student caught her eye for a moment, his face tight with silent recognition, but he quickly looked away. He knew this scene all too well, and fear kept him silent. Marjgery moved slowly toward the waiting area, her heels clicking softly against the polished tile. She lowered herself onto one of the hard plastic chairs beneath the sterile white lights. She didn't cry, didn't lash out. She simply opened her phone, scrolling through the confirmation emails, the booking code, the calendar entries, Everything was in perfect order. Nothing had changed, except the treatment. Opening her notes app, she began to log each moment with quiet precision. Tanya Bennett, denial reason system, auto-adjust due to internal flag, attitude dismissive mocking. She documented the smirk, the public tone, the crowd's passive response. She wasn't a victim in this moment. She was a recorder of truth. No one around her noticed. But that moment, seemingly still and uneventful, marked the beginning of a careful investigation. Not with outrage, but with method. Not with revenge, but with accountability. This wasn't the first time she'd done this. As a black woman nearing 60 at the helm of a near-billion-dollar empire, she had learned that the most effective form of justice was never loud. It was thorough. Across the counter, Megan Hayes was texting under the desk, eyes flicking between the screen and the boarding list. "That old lady is still here," she typed into a staff group chat called Elite Crew Lounge. "First class, yeah, right." Attached was a photo snapped without consent of Marjgery sitting with her head bowed. Chuck Evans, the grizzled veteran employee with the weary face and sharp eyes, replied with a sticker, "Drama Queen Alert." Laughter emojis followed. These weren't explicit insults, but they were sharper than any slur. They revealed the core culture that tolerated exclusion and dressed it up in uniform and protocol. And still, Marjgery sat unmoving, observing recording. No tremble, no protest, just note after note. Her expression remained composed, but her resolve deepened with each quiet keystroke. No one noticed her fingers storing the seeds of a reckoning. They thought they had erased her, but they had awakened her. From behind the counter, Megan smirked toward Chuck and typed another message. "Bet she's going to make a scene. Better call security before she starts shouting." They laughed. Chuck shrugged, barely interested. "Old folks always think they're important. Let her wait it out." But Marjgery wasn't planning to shout. She was preparing to strike in silence. Her camera clicked once. She had quietly captured a photo of the desk and the staff behind it. Another click. She saved the screen of her digital ticket, the time-stamped confirmation. Evidence. She wasn't building a complaint. She was constructing a case. She had done it before. Not always this public, not always this visible, but this wasn't new. She'd spent decades in boardrooms where men pretended not to hear her, in partnerships where clients ignored her until her title surfaced. She had mastered the art of quiet resistance. To everyone else, she was just an aging woman in an airport lounge, quietly sitting out a glitch. But beneath that exterior, a storm had begun to gather force. The next move would not be emotional, it would be strategic. And when it came, no one at JFK would see it coming. From her quiet corner of the waiting area, Marjgery Reed watched the airport machinery spin like clockwork. Uniformed agents moved swiftly behind counters. Jet engines hummed on the runway beyond the glass. Voices crackled over loudspeakers. To most, it was just another morning at JFK. But to Marjgery, the rhythm masked something more sinister, an invisible wall carefully built to keep certain people out. She stood up, adjusted her navy coat, and approached the information desk. Her tone was even her voice polite. "Excuse me, I've been reassigned from a first-class seat I paid for. Could someone direct me to the appropriate supervisor?" The young man behind the counter didn't even meet her eyes. "Ma'am, we can't assist with check-in issues here. Please return to the front counter." "I've already spoken with the staff there. I'm trying to resolve." "I'm sorry," he cut in, still not lifting his gaze. "You'll need to speak with the desk that issued the ticket." She gave a slow nod. "Thank you." And she noted his name from his badge. Another line in her case log. Marjgery turned and headed for the boarding area checkpoint. As she approached the security guard standing near the gate, she held out her boarding pass. "I'd like to speak with a gate supervisor, please. It's regarding a serious error." The guard glanced at her pass, shrugged, and muttered, "You're not on the first-class list, ma'am. Please wait in the economy zone until your group is called." "I understand," she replied calmly, "but I have documentation showing I was booked in seat 2A. Ma'am, please stand aside." You're blocking traffic. With barely concealed contempt, he turned to help another passenger. This one a white man in business attire who received a warm nod and swift wave through. Marjorie stepped aside, her posture straight, despite the tightness in her chest. At a row of chairs just beyond the checkpoint, she sat again, scanning the crowd. Each face looked the same, distracted, impatient, too busy to notice her. Too afraid to ask why she, with a first-class ticket, wasn't being allowed to board with the other elite passengers. On the far side of the terminal, Megan Hayes and Chuck Evans leaned over the service counter, laughing at something on Megan's phone. She tilted the screen slightly away from public view. You won't believe the face she made when Tanya bumped her, like she expected us to roll out a red carpet. Chuck chuckled, eyes narrowing with amusement. She probably thought saying it politely would help. It never does. Megan smirked. They never learn. This isn't a charity lounge. What neither of them noticed was the silent figure seated at an angle nearby, Jason Patel, a seasoned business traveler in his 40s. Dressed in an elegant gray blazer, his dark eyes tracked the interaction from a distance. He didn't say a word. Not yet. But he'd seen everything from Tanya's initial smirk to the quiet snubbing at the checkpoint. He recognized what was happening, and he wasn't the only one. Across the lounge, a young Latina mother rocking her baby in a carrier watched with rising unease. A teenage boy scrolling through his phone kept glancing up, his jaw tightening. One by one, a few passengers began to sense it, the unease, the pattern. But still no one spoke. Marjgery took another slow breath. Her phone buzzed. A message from her assistant in Los Angeles lit up the screen. Our legal team has received initial logs from JFK systems. Several messages match prior risk indicators. Awaiting confirmation to proceed, she typed back. Proceed. Begin gathering timestamps. Match names to video logs. Back at the front counter, Megan sent another image to the staff group chat, Marjorie sitting with her suitcase between her knees. The caption, Queen of Complaints, still waiting. More emojis followed, a sticker of a judge slamming a gavel. Here come the lawsuits, someone added. Chuck wrote, give her a gold star for persistence. They were used to this. Disbelief, dismissal, distraction. But they had underestimated who they were dealing with. At 9:03 a.m., Marjorie stood again. She walked, not rushed, not hesitated, straight to the main boarding desk. The woman standing behind the podium wore the badge of a shift supervisor, Karen Smith. Mid-40s, curled brown hair, red lipstick that made her expression seem permanently disapproving. Marjorie placed her printed boarding pass on the counter. Karen didn't even look up. Yes, I'd like to ask about my first-class booking. Seat 2A. I've been reassigned without explanation. I have all confirmation emails and my ticket. Karen sighed. She picked up the ticket, scanned it for a split second, then let it drop like trash. System says 34C. She said loud enough for everyone to hear. That's what it is now. I paid for first class. I have proof, ma'am, Karen said, now clearly annoyed, your voice. Loan disqualifies you from first class. The room froze. Even Megan looked up. Even Chuck's smirk faltered. Marjgery didn't move, didn't blink. But her silence roared louder than any protest. The room seemed suspended in time. For a long moment, no one breathed. Karen's words, your voice alone disqualifies you from first class, hung like smoke over the terminal. People heard them. Everyone heard them. But no one moved. Marjgery Reed stood completely still. Her hands didn't flinch. Her eyes didn't narrow. She didn't need to shout, didn't need to plead. The look she gave Karen Smith was quiet and surgical, a gaze sharpened by decades of being underestimated. She bent down, picked up the ticket Karen had tossed back, and carefully slid it into a leather folio in her handbag, right next to a copy of the airport's official anti-discrimination policy. I understand, Marjgery said softly, and she turned away. Karen let out a quiet scoff and returned to her monitor. Next, she called as if she hadn't just delivered a line that would be replayed in legal depositions and news broadcasts for months. As Marjgery walked toward the lounge once more, She passed passengers who now looked at her differently. Some averted their eyes, ashamed to have stood by. Others whispered behind cupped hands. A few were bold enough to take video clips with their phones, pretending to scroll, but capturing every second. She didn't look at any of them. Her steps were slow, deliberate, and full of clarity. Meanwhile, at JFK's operations control, a cascade of alerts was quietly unfolding. Reed Global Travel's internal system had flagged JFK's partner status for review. Several booking portals had stopped syncing VIP data, and a list of flagged personnel names was being compiled. Tanya Bennett, Grant Miller, Megan Hayes, Chuck Evans, Karen Smith. Marjgery reached the lounge and sat again, folding her coat neatly beside her. She opened her phone and created a new folder. JFK, Incident 47. Inside it, she filed voice memos, screenshots, photos of each staff member, and a typed timeline from 7:15 a.m. onward. She marked the moment of reassignment, the quote from Karen, and even the names of the passengers who had watched without stepping in. At the same time, across the lounge, Jason Patel stood from his seat. He wasn't the type to make scenes. But this wasn't about making scene. It was about drawing a line. He approached the counter calmly but with firm posture. "I saw what happened," he said to the attendant. "That woman, Miss Reed, was holding a first-class ticket. She showed her confirmation, and she was denied access, mocked and insulted in full public view." The staff member stammered. "Sir, we're not allowed to discuss other passengers." "I'm not asking for details," Jason replied. "I'm reporting an incident of discrimination that I personally witnessed." A pause, then silence. Jason scanned the faces behind the counter. "Let me be clear, I'm not leaving this counter until someone takes formal note of what just occurred. And if you won't, I'll go straight to the Department of Transportation and the press." This wasn't just a bystander complaint anymore. Jason was a known executive in the airline industry, an independent board advisor for several international aviation alliances. His words carried weight. Behind the scenes, tension rippled. Grant Miller, who had been lurking just out of view behind a staff door, was quickly called to the counter. He emerged with stiff shoulders and a forced smile. "Sir, we are handling the issue internally." "I assure you handling it," Jason snapped. "You just stood by while your team publicly humiliated a VIP traveler. Do you even understand who that woman is?" A flicker of unease crossed Grant's face. I believe her name is Marjgery Reed," Jason said. "CEO of Reed Global Travel, your top-tier partner, a woman who moves nearly $1 billion in annual travel contracts." Grant's lips parted, but no sound came. He looked over at Karen, whose confidence had begun to evaporate. Megan Hayes glanced away. Chuck Evans shifted uncomfortably. They had made a mistake, and now the room knew it. Back in the lounge, Marjgery's phone buzzed again. From legal team, 10:26 a.m. Outbound routing update complete. JFK and ATL partnerships currently suspended. Denver and Miami confirmed as reroute hubs. News embargo begins at noon. Shall we issue NDAs to impacted vendors? She responded with a single word. Yes, it was happening. Across the terminal, operations dashboards began flashing red. A senior analyst in the JFK vendor office noticed bookings dropping by the minute. Dozens of international VIP clients suddenly rerouted. Travel apps froze. Call centers were flooded with confused passengers asking why their Reed Global charters were canceled. And still, none of the frontline staff had any idea of the storm they had triggered. Jason Patel left the counter and walked back to the lounge, stopping just beside Marjgery. He said nothing at first. Then gently, "I'm sorry for what they did. I saw it all. You deserve none of it." Marjgery looked up. Her eyes met his, and she offered a faint, grateful nod. Not of weakness, but of shared recognition, one professional acknowledging another. Then she said something that would stick with him for years. "They tried to erase me with silence. Now they'll hear mine echo louder than anything they have ever said." Jason didn't respond. He simply sat nearby. He didn't need to say more. because the reckoning had already begun. In the operations wing of JFK, panic had not yet taken hold, but tremors had begun. Within minutes of Reed Global's silent withdrawal, technical systems staggered. Vendor dashboards glitched. VIP access requests were denied. The executive suite's internal alert system flagged a Tier 1 partnership disruption. Still, most floor staff remained unaware. To them, the day seemed routine until calls started pouring in. Why are our Zurich bookings failing to process? Why are our premium clients being rerouted through Miami? What happened to the Reed Global Concierge portal? And then the bigger question, who authorized a downgrade on Reed herself? Meanwhile, Marjgery Reed remained seated in the lounge, composed, silent, unmoving. She watched the rush of passengers as if watching tides shift from a distance. She wasn't waiting for justice. She was watching it unfold. Across the terminal, Megan Hayes' phone buzzed. She looked down casually, expecting another joke in the staff group chat. Instead, a stark notification appeared. Account access revoked. See supervisor immediately, her brow furrowed. Then another suspension pending review, conduct violation. What the? She muttered. Chuck, seated at the adjacent station, leaned over. What's going on? I think we're being audited. At that exact moment, Grant Miller stepped out of the staff corridor, pale and shaking. Everyone, all Reed-related files, shut them down. Do not answer vendor calls. Direct everything to legal. Karen, still standing at the main counter, overheard the chaos behind her. She turned, frowning. What's happening now? Grant's response was curt. Everything is happening, but still the front desk operated. Flights were still boarding. Security lines still pulsed. And Tanya Bennett. She simply poured herself a fresh cup of coffee. They're just blowing smoke, she said to Chuck. What's she gonna do, sue the airport? Chuck didn't answer. He had just received the same access denial message Megan had. His fingers froze on the keyboard. This wasn't a threat. This was execution. Back in the lounge, Jason Patel had quietly moved 2 seats closer to Marjgery. He didn't speak, but his presence was protective. 2 older black women had joined the lounge minutes earlier, both VIP clients of Reed Global. They spotted her, exchanged a glance, and sat nearby in solidarity. No one needed to say a word. The mood was shifting. And that was when JFK's executive boardroom exploded. Red banners danced across live dashboards. Reed Global withdrawal confirmed. Contract freeze ATL plus JFK Tier 1 status. International charter routes rerouted. Director Anderson Bell slammed his tablet onto the conference table. What in hell happened? Who approved the treatment of a billion-dollar client like this? No one answered. Legal counsel began printing out transcripts from internal chats. One after another, screenshots of memes, jokes, and offensive nicknames, every one of them damning. Karen's quote appeared next. Your voice alone disqualifies you from first class. Silence. Then someone whispered. She said that aloud. One assistant nodded. In front of a crowd. It's on video. The atmosphere thickened. Leaders exchanged nervous glances. No one wanted to be associated. No one wanted to be the reason for a $950 million partnership collapse. By the time the full list of staff names came into the review, the reality was clear. The airport had humiliated the founder of Reed Global Travel publicly, and the price was now spiraling. Back in the terminal, Ron Wallace stepped into the lounge with 2 other managers. They spotted Marjgery seated quietly, surrounded now by several VIPs, Jason, the 2 elderly women, and a young flight captain who had also quietly joined the circle. Ron approached cautiously. Mrs. Reed, may I speak with you privately? She looked up, not angry, not bitter, just steady. I have nothing more to say, she replied. The time for conversation was when I stood at your counter with my ticket. Ma'am, Ron said, trying to smile, I understand there's been miscommunication. Let us restore your seat. First class, lounge access reinstated, complimentary concierge for your next 5 flights. Around them, other travelers began listening. A few phones went up. Marjgery tilted her head. You believe this is about a seat, Ron swallowed. I, well, yes. A pause. She leaned forward. This is about culture, about how you protect small-minded gatekeepers because they smile and say, please, while disrespecting your highest value clients. This is about $1 billion silence you all refuse to hear. The line behind Ron grew quiet. She stood. You've given me all I need. You can send the rest through legal. Jason Patel rose beside her. I'll make sure she gets to her flight. Ron watched helplessly as they walked past, and Megan, Tanya, Karen, and Chuck. They all stared at the scene, each one wondering the same thing. What happens when a woman you tried to erase turns your entire system into a lesson the world will never forget? At Gate 17, the boarding area was unusually quiet. A silence hung in the air. Not the typical pre-boarding hush, but a thick, uncertain kind, the kind that lingered when something irreversible had just occurred. Marjgery Reed sat near the window, her figure silhouetted by the rising sun. She wasn't staring at the runway or watching the planes. Her eyes were on her phone, scrolling through updates. Not news headlines, but live internal messages from Reed Global's legal and logistics divisions. They read like coordinated fire drills, vendor blackout confirmed, international business clients rerouted to Denver, Miami, and LAX. Executive contracts from JFK and ATL placed under review. Media inquiries hold. No comment, await further instruction. Marjorie closed the screen and slipped the device back into her coat pocket. She didn't need to see more. She already knew the airport was scrambling. What mattered now was something deeper, a restoration of personal dignity, not through public apology, but through the quiet rebalancing of power. Across from her, a pair of uniformed agents whispered nervously. They had just been briefed about a priority passenger disruption earlier that morning and warned to prepare for escalated visibility. One of them pointed discreetly at Marjgery recognition dawning. Neither moved to approach her. Meanwhile, Tanya Bennett stood stiffly at the staff terminal, arms folded across her chest. She had been instructed by her supervisor not to speak to the press, not to issue any statements, and under no circumstance was she to approach Marjgery Reed again. Tanya's posture said defiance, but her eyes betrayed concern. Her hands trembled just slightly as she pretended to straighten her name badge. Near baggage handling, Chuck Evans sat in the staff lounge scrolling furiously through his phone. His private airport staff chat had gone dark. Dozens of jokes, emojis, and sarcastic remarks had been deleted. A warning banner now appeared on login. All content under legal review. Access suspended. Chuck muttered under his breath. They're actually serious. Megan Hayes was pacing outside the employee hallway. She hadn't spoken to anyone in the last 30 minutes. Her messages to Tanya went unread. Her login credentials failed. Her last attempt to swipe into the admin terminal was denied. Her job hadn't been officially terminated, but she knew it was just a matter of time. Inside the lounge, Jason Patel glanced around and quietly sat next to Marjorie again. He didn't speak. He just nodded once, a quiet gesture of respect and presence. I'm still here, his silence seemed to say. Marjorie returned the nod. She appreciated it more than words. A little further down the seating row, an elderly white gentleman dressed in a tailored three-piece suit, his platinum frequent flyer tag visible on his briefcase, watched the scene with intrigue. He hadn't said anything when he saw Marjorie being mistreated earlier, but now something about her presence had shifted. He stood up, walked over, and without a word offered his seat when the gate agent called for pre-boarding. I believe this is yours, he said gently. Marjorie smiled faintly. Thank you, but I already have my seat. He chuckled quietly as if knowing full well what that meant. Indeed you do. When the agent announced first-class boarding, she walked forward. No velvet rope this time, no stares from Tanya, just quiet respect from passengers who understood finally who she was, not because of headlines, not because of anger, but because she never once raised her voice. Her scanned ticket beeped once. Green light, valid, recognized. The agent nodded without meeting her eyes. But there was no smirk, No scoff, no redirection. Just silence, the kind that finally respected her presence. As she walked down the jet bridge, a flurry of messages pulsed across internal terminals inside JFK's operations center. Financial departments scrambled. PR teams held emergency meetings. Every employee from the earlier encounter was being reviewed and some already quietly suspended. The fear wasn't just reputational damage. It was the realization that the system wasn't untouchable. Reed Global's influence didn't arrive with media attention. It arrived in the form of revoked contracts, shifted flight paths, and quiet power. A system built on invisible assumptions had collided with one that operated through invisible correction. And now every silence spoke volumes. When Marjgery reached her seat 2A, she settled in. The cabin crew, unusually tense, treated her with exacting courtesy. A hot towel, a welcome drink, the menu. No excessive smiles, just polished professionalism. She didn't need their guilt. She needed their competence. She glanced around the cabin. The overhead lights reflected softly against the leather seats. Outside airport personnel raced across the tarmac trying to manage chaos behind the scenes. None of it mattered now. The system had already begun its slow collapse. As the aircraft taxied toward the runway, Marjorie closed her eyes not from fatigue, but reflection. She hadn't spoken much today, yet the weight of her presence had been louder than any outburst. Where others might have screamed or fought or demanded apologies, she had taken notes, logged offenses, executed protocol, and reshaped the future. This wasn't just about one flight. It was about every airport, every terminal, every desk where someone in uniform believed they could gatekeep dignity. And the silence, it was no longer theirs to use. It was hers now. As Flight 312 ascended smoothly into the morning sky, the city below shrinking into a quilt of geometry and shadows. Marjgery Reed reclined gently in her first-class seat, seat 2A, the one she had earned, the one they tried to take from her. Outside, clouds drifted like slow-moving thoughts. Inside, however, the machinery of justice was accelerating. Her phone vibrated once. Message from Legal Ops Press, inquiries rising. Reed Global remains silent per protocol. Internal audit timeline accelerated. Initial response window closes in 12 hours. She turned off the notification and stared out the window. The quiet hum of the aircraft echoed like distant thunder, building behind layers of decorum. For the first time in hours, no one was watching her. No smug gate agents, no mocking glances, no tightened lips or sarcastic smirks. Just the steady professionalism of the flight crew who now knew her name by heart. A flight attendant with neatly braided hair approached discreetly. "Miss Reed, we've confirmed that your luggage is being held with priority tagging now. May I bring you anything else?" Marjorie gave a polite shake of the head. No, thank you. She didn't need anything. Everything she needed had already been set in motion. Back at JFK, however, the temperature in the operations center had shifted from cool professionalism to barely restrained panic. Anderson Bell, the director of international sales, was pacing furiously in a glass-walled conference room, barking instructions to legal and partnerships teams. His tie was undone, sweat visible at his temples. "What do you mean she initiated Protocol D herself? Who gave her access?" he snapped at a junior coordinator. "She is the CEO, sir, founder." "Full access level," came the meek reply. Another executive added, "Our partners in Singapore just pulled 6 high-value group itineraries. Dubai's already rerouting their entire August charter flow. This isn't a PR problem," Bell growled. "It's structural collapse." And it was, not just in JFK. At ATL, Atlanta's Hartsfield International, the partner terminal was flooded with cancellations. Contracts with Reed Global control brands were being terminated in real time. Meetings were called every 30 minutes. Every department was combing their systems for relevant chat logs, video footage, and customer correspondence. A sense of dread crept in like cold mist. No one dared say it aloud, but everyone was thinking it. What if she makes this permanent in JFK's HR division? Karen Smith's dismissal was already under final review. The legal language in the report was surgical: gross misconduct, public discriminatory behavior, and system-wide reputational damage in excess of $950 million projected over Q3, Q4. The entire chain of employees, Ron Wallace, Tanya Bennett, Grant Miller, Megan Hayes, and Chuck Evans, was now flagged internally as under terminal review. Chuck, still unaware of the full gravity, sent a sarcastic message to the group chat. Guess we're the scapegoats now. Who knew an old lady could pull that much weight? He didn't know. It had already cloned the chat server. In a sleek skyscraper in Midtown Manhattan, Reed Global's legal team met in a glass-encased war room. Lawyers, public affairs, strategists, and crisis architects worked in silence. On the central screen, names, time codes, quotes, and screenshots. They weren't building a lawsuit. They were building a doctrine. Let them guess what's next, said Marjgery's lead counsel, Delilah Nwosu, a Nigerian-born strategist with a reputation for ending careers quietly. They don't need noise. We'll let the silence grind them into reform. On the flight, Marjgery pulled out a cream folder from her leather handbag. Inside, a handwritten letter. Not to the staff who disrespected her, not to the partners scrambling to make amends, but to herself. It was a ritual she had followed for years, writing herself a message after any major turning point. She believed that words written in solitude were the truest form of legacy. She uncapped a gold pen and began, "They tried to displace me, not with force, but with the weight of their collective disregard. I answered not with rage, but with calculation. Let them remember not what I said, but what I did not need to say. Power is not in how loud you cry, it's in how precise you correct." She paused, letting the ink dry, then sealed the envelope. Across the aisle, a young man in his 30s tapped his laptop, pausing now and then to glance at her. His expression was that of curiosity, uncertain but respectful. He'd seen the headlines in the pre-boarding lounge. He recognized the name. After a few moments, he leaned over. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, soft-spoken. "Are you Mrs. Reed of Reed Global?" Marjgery looked up, gave him a measured nod. "My mother runs a small travel agency in Oakland," he said. "She told me once that your company made it possible for her to survive the pandemic. I just wanted to say thank you. And what you did today, I saw, and I think a lot more people will too." She smiled, not as a celebrity, not as a corporate titan, but as a woman who had endured and outlasted. "Tell your mother," she said gently, "the work she does matters. The world just needs to catch up." As the plane cruised towards San Francisco, 35,000 feet above the fallout, Marjgery Reed sat composed, a storm of retribution still unfolding quietly beneath her. But from here, it was clear the system had made its move, and now she was making hers. The moment Flight 312 touched down in San Francisco, the sun greeted the tarmac with a blinding brilliance. The Pacific air, salt tinged and cool, drifted through the open doors of the jet bridge as passengers gathered their belongings. But Marjgery Reed did not rush. She remained in seat 2A, her phone in hand, scanning the final logistics confirmations sent by her legal and executive teams. Everything had been executed. The charter suspensions, the client reroutes, the vendor freezes. The international fallout had begun rolling in like a controlled avalanche. As she stepped off the plane, a junior concierge from the Reed Global West Coast office was waiting by the gate, young, eager, holding a discreet sign with her initials. "Miss Reed, we've arranged for your car. A media team is gathering outside, but per instructions, we've issued no statement. Just say the word if you'd like us to escort you through the alternate terminal." Marjgery gave him a small nod. No cameras, no detours. Let them see silence walk. As they exited, murmurs began to follow her like ripples across a pond. A few reporters shouted questions. "Miss Reed, is it true JFK and ATL lost over $300 million in bookings in 48 hours? Do you plan to sue the airport directly? Or more shutdowns coming?" She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence was more powerful than any soundbite. Across the country, back in New York, chaos was mutating into reckoning. Internal memos at JFK flagged over 112 canceled high-profile itineraries and an additional 41 vendor withdrawals. Contracts that took years to cultivate were falling apart within hours. Department heads scrambled for damage control, but no department could find stable footing. At the core of the panic was a single name, Marjgery Reed, and yet she had said nothing publicly. In a dark paneled boardroom on the 42nd floor of the JFK Administration Tower, Anderson Bell sat in silence as a special session of the Emergency Committee reviewed evidence of the internal collapse. On a large screen, screenshots of employee messages flickered like a silent trial. The damning chat threads, the mocking emojis, the audio recordings, the timestamps, the surveillance clips. Each item drove another nail into the structure they once thought untouchable. The HR director turned to the table. "We're past apologies. She has receipts for everything. If she wanted to file suit, we're exposed, not just legally, but reputationally globally." Another executive chimed in, voice strained. "Have we reached out?" The room went silent. They all knew the answer. Reed Global's only response had been a set of legal documents acknowledging breach of partnership. No phone calls were taken, no meetings were granted, no dialogue was offered. Just a surgical withdrawal of presence, executed without a single press release. Across the terminal floor, passengers still arrived and departed oblivious to the invisible quake beneath them. But the staff now whispered with trembling lips. "Did you hear who got terminated? Karen's gone. Grant, too. They say Megan's under review by the DOJ's Bias and Compliance Board. What about Chuck He's hiding in HR?" The culture of invincibility had shattered, but the collapse hadn't reached its final layer yet. Meanwhile, in San Francisco, Marjorie settled into her private car, a sleek black vehicle that blended into the morning traffic. As it pulled away from the airport, she tapped her phone and opened the Reed Global Secure Internal Portal. There she reviewed one last item on her agenda compass forward. Her foundation's anti-discrimination initiative had been quiet until now, mainly policy consulting, training small scholarship programs. But today's events had given it something rare momentum. She wrote a short directive to her communications director, begin National Compass forward rollout. Focus airline staff training, institutional reform, racial bias intervention, frontline reporting tools. Target completion 12 months. Make it mandatory for all Reed Global partners. Fund expansion is needed. She hit send, then leaned back and let her eyes close just for a moment. The war was not over, but the battle had been won without fury, without spectacle, with sheer deliberate power. By the time she arrived at her Pacific Heights brownstone, a quiet sanctuary nestled behind a tall iron gate, the phone was already vibrating again. Her assistant's message, "NBC, just aired the segment. CNN and BBC are prepping features. They're calling it the silent shutdown. Airports worldwide are reviewing their training policies." She didn't reply. Instead, she walked to her study, sat beneath a painting of her grandmother, one of the first black female pilots in Georgia, and placed her phone on the desk beside the letter she'd written to herself. On the wall was a quote in brass letters, "Dignity requires no defense. It stands alone." She took a deep breath and allowed herself one moment of stillness. They had tried to erase her. She replied not with wrath, but with infrastructure. Now the silence they once used to humiliate her had turned against them, roaring through corporate systems and contract pipelines, leaving devastation in its wake. And not a word had been shouted. Inside the JFK administrative wing, the aftermath unfolded like a slow-burning disaster film. Department heads met in back-to-back emergency sessions. The glow of screens showed spreadsheets, bleeding red budgets, collapsing vendor lists, shrinking by the hour. The airport's premium partners had either paused or pulled out. Every loss had a timestamp, every absence a cause. And at the center of the collapse, without ever lifting her voice, stood Marjgery Reed. In one meeting, Anderson Bell, JFK's director of international sales, snapped his pen in half as he read aloud the latest update. Zurich, Frankfurt, Singapore gone. Denver and Miami are absorbing everything. His assistant, face pale, added, "Sir, we've also received word from the Global Aviation Council. They've opened an ethics investigation based on the Reed Global incident." Anderson sank back in his seat. She didn't file a lawsuit. She didn't even speak to a reporter. How the hell did she destroy us this thoroughly? No one answered, because they all knew the silence of someone like Marjgery wasn't weakness. It was precision. It was power without noise. Downstairs, the frontline staff were living a very different storm. Tanya Bennett sat in the employee lounge, her once perfect bun now slightly undone, reading the formal notice taped to the break room wall. Mandatory anti-bias retraining. Failure to attend will result in immediate termination. Next to it was a second notice, effective immediately. All staff use of group messaging applications will be monitored and archived. She looked over at Chuck Evans, who stood frozen at the coffee machine, stirring a cup of instant coffee that had long gone cold. Neither spoke. The camaraderie that once bound them, the smug confidence, the laughter over memes, the jokes behind customer backs, had curdled into fear. A new HR team hired on emergency retainer had begun sweeping through every record, every chat log, every phone transcript. Employees who had once mocked the old lady with the southern accent now panicked over every emoji they'd ever sent. Meanwhile, at the Reed Global offices in San Francisco, a different kind of war room was in motion. The legal department, composed of veterans from federal law, international business, and civil rights advocacy, had compiled a 174-page dossier of the entire incident. But there were no plans to sue, not yet. Instead, Marjgery had instructed a different response. "Send a redacted version to our top 200 partners," she said, standing beside a digital map where red lines traced the global flight patterns Reed Global had just rerouted. Not as a threat, as a warning. The message was subtle. We do not retaliate. We redirect. The next morning, airlines, hotel chains, and tourism boards across 5 continents received an encrypted briefing with the subject line, "Client Misalignment Indignity Protocol, Response Overview." Inside were summaries of what had happened. No names, no slander, just evidence, facts, and a call to reassess internal procedures to ensure no client would endure what Marjgery had. The industry listened. Within 48 hours, 6 major travel networks requested private consultations with Compass Forward to audit their practices. 3 sent letters of apology. 1 CEO flew to San Francisco for a closed-door meeting. In every instance, Reed Global remained poised, reserved, gracious. But the unspoken message rang loud. You're either aligned with dignity or you're out. Back in New York, news had begun to trickle to the public. Although Marjgery's name was not yet viral, the story itself was exploding. Elderly black woman quietly disrupts billion-dollar industry, JFK in freefall, after silent power move, the high cost of disrespect. These headlines didn't need Marjgery's photo. They didn't need her voice. Her silence had done all the speaking. Among JFK staff, morale had shattered. Megan Hayes had been placed on administrative leave. Her phone seized. Her access to all internal systems revoked. Every private chat she'd once found funny now read like evidence of cruelty. Her younger coworkers, once laughing along, now avoided eye contact. Some, trying to shield themselves, began whispering to HR that they'd always found the culture toxic. But it was too late for redemption. The system was turning on itself. Meanwhile, Ron Wallace sat alone in his car in the employee lot, the same clipboard from the day he ordered Marjgery escorted out. Now resting beside him like a weapon he no longer had the strength to lift. His dismissal letter had arrived via email. It was brief, effective immediately, breach of trust, loss of partner confidence, no severance due to cause-related termination. He stared at the message, then at the people walking past his windshield, people he used to command. Now he was invisible, and still not one word from Marjgery. Not a tweet, not a statement. She had gone back to work as if nothing had happened. But every boardroom from JFK to ATL, from Zurich to Dubai, now knew that silence wasn't absence. It was presence with purpose. As Marjgery looked over a briefing packet that evening in her study, her assistant approached. Miss Reed Forbes wants an exclusive interview. CNN's asked twice. Should I know, she said without looking up. Let the silence linger. And with that, she closed the folder, walked to her kitchen, and poured herself a glass of water, clear, crisp still. She had earned her peace in the world. It was still catching up. The following week, the JFK administrative offices felt more like a courtroom than an airport. Silent hallways echoed with clipped footsteps and whispered conversations. Middle managers deleted old messages. Legal assistants pulled archived training logs. The entire structure, so confident in its untouchable status days earlier, now operated under a cloud of uncertainty and internal suspicion. Karen Smith, the shift supervisor whose words had reverberated through the terminal like a dagger, "Your voice alone disqualifies you from first class," sat under harsh fluorescent lighting facing an internal review panel. Across from her, three executives in Navy suits flipped through binders filled with screenshots, time logs, witness statements, and security footage. Karen's hands, once so assured when waving away passengers like Marjgery Reed, now trembled as she turned over her employee badge. "We've reviewed the footage," said Executive Director Raymond Lister. "We've seen the group chat messages, the mocking tone, the visible disregard for a paying passenger. Miss Smith, this wasn't a mistake. It was a pattern, a culture you helped enforce." Karen, once a proud gatekeeper of the VIP experience, now sat mute. Her arrogance had evaporated. No explanation would suffice. At the same time, Grant Miller, formerly praised as a detail-oriented manager, received his own dismissal letter. He'd long believed that professionalism meant silence, neutrality, staying out of trouble. But his refusal to speak up when he had the chance to intervene when he saw Marjgery's ticket and chose not to challenge the system had branded him complicit. Grant stood in his office staring at the lock screen of his company tablet. It had deactivated without warning. A small slip of paper on his desk, his own checklist of shift responsibilities, mocked him with one forgotten line: protect VIP integrity. Ironically, it was Marjgery's integrity he'd ignored, and now it was his own that had unraveled. Downstairs, Megan Hayes' world was collapsing even faster. She had been suspended immediately, her locker emptied by airport security. Her mocking posts about Marjgery, once exchanged like harmless banter among staff, had been leaked. Screenshots spread online with horrifying speed. Imagine paying for first class and sounding like that one post read. "Drama queen alert, old lady about to file a lawsuit," read another. Underneath, comment sections exploded with outrage. Thousands condemned her actions. Former customers of JFK and ATL began sharing their own experiences, stories of being humiliated, ignored, profiled, and pushed aside. For every insult Megan had typed, 100 real people now responded. She sat in her apartment with the blinds drawn, watching her name trend for all the wrong reasons. Her inbox was flooded with messages, not just from strangers, but from friends asking how she could have been so heartless. Her parents had called twice. She hadn't picked up. On her screen, one message stood out. From Compass Forward Foundation, subject application received. It was an automated confirmation. The form she'd filled out at 3 a.m. after hours of reading about Marjgery Reed and realizing she'd not just hurt one woman, but helped enforce a culture that had pushed countless others into silence. Her message had been brief. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I need to understand how to change." The response: no rejection. Just a single line: "You'll be contacted shortly." Back at Reed Global HQ, Marjgery received that update from her legal director. She applied, the director said with measured calm. "We'll screen it with the rest." Marjgery nodded but said nothing. She was not vindictive. She simply believed in accountability. And if growth came from it, even from someone like Megan, she wouldn't stand in its way. Meanwhile, airport leadership scrambled to regain their footing. Emergency retraining programs were launched across JFK and ATL. Internal memos flooded staff inboxes. Consultants were hired to audit hiring practices, customer service protocols, and the ethics of frontline management. But the damage had been done. Vendors once proud to associate with the airports now demanded clarity. What assurances can you provide one international partner asked that your staff won't humiliate our clients for their accent or age? There were no easy answers. In contrast, Reed Global's stock had risen. Clients, especially women older travelers and those from historically marginalized groups, flooded its booking systems with messages of support. Emails read, "Thank you for standing up. I've never felt seen until now. Your silence spoke for all of us." In a board meeting, Reed Global's CFO reported a 17% increase in long-term loyalty contracts, record numbers for a non-promotional month. And yet Marjgery remained quiet. She had no desire for a victory lap. This had never been about revenge. It was about restoration, about letting the system feel the weight of its own arrogance and letting that lesson last. At JFK's morning briefing, a new supervisor stood before the assembled crew. Her name was Maria Alvarez, mid-40s Puerto Rican formerly overlooked by the old guard. She opened with this, "From today, we check people's names, not their accents. We serve based on their ticket, not their appearance. And if anyone sees bias, yours or someone else's, you report it, or you leave." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The tone had changed. The silence had cracked. And far away in a quiet office in San Francisco, Marjgery Reed looked out over the bay and thought to herself, let them rebuild, but never let them forget. Far beyond the terminals of JFK and ATL, the fallout from Reed Global's silent strike rippled through the entire aviation and travel industry. What had started as one black woman's quiet protest against mockery and exclusion had triggered a tsunami of reassessment in corporate boardrooms, client service divisions, and frontline operations from Heathrow to Hong Kong. In Zurich, a prestigious travel association gathered for its annual Global Service Integrity Summit. Normally filled with talks of industry forecasts and high-speed luxury trends, this year's opening keynote shifted unexpectedly. On the central screen appeared a quote, "Sometimes silence isn't absence, it's authority choosing not to shout." The room hushed as executives leaned in. The speaker, a tall British-Nigerian woman named Dr. Amaka Sewell, nodded toward the quote. "We are no longer in the age where a passenger is just a passenger. Today, that silent traveler you humiliate could command an empire. And when that traveler chooses not to make a scene, but instead holds receipts, you'd best prepare for your foundation to crumble." The audience sat stunned. Then applause erupted. Marjgery Reed's name wasn't mentioned directly, but every attendee knew exactly who had sparked the industry's reckoning. Back in the United States, major publications rolled out coverage under banners like, "How One Elderly Woman Made Airports Remember Humanity," "Reed Global's Silent War," "A Masterclass in Dignified Disruption," "The Price of Mocking a CEO with a Southern Accent." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. No major press release had ever been issued. No interview given, not even a comment from Marjgery herself. Just a ripple of structural collapse echoing in every direction. Within the Compass Forward Foundation, the nonprofit Marjgery had founded years earlier, the inbox flooded with messages from whistleblowers, staffers, even passengers who now felt empowered to speak. "I never knew how to stand up for myself until I saw what you did without yelling. I'm 62. I've been called ma'am with that fake smirk too many times. I cried watching the silence win. I want to work for you. Teach me how to dismantle systems like this." Marjgery read each message quietly, tagging those for follow-up mentoring or foundation support. Her office had grown busier, but her inner rhythm remained unchanged, measured, focused, unstoppable. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, JFK and ATL's leadership faced a secondary crisis, this time internal. Union representatives, long dismissed by upper management, suddenly held leverage. You want to protect the airport's image, then give our frontline workers proper anti-bias training. Make dignity part of policy, not just damage control. Vendors push back too. We won't renew unless your staff undergoes third-party evaluations. We're not risking a billion-dollar partner over unchecked arrogance. Karen Smith's dismissal had only been the beginning. By the end of the week, 12 other staff members across both airports were either suspended or placed under investigation for prior incidents that suddenly resurfaced. One involved a black tech executive denied boarding in 2022. Another, a Latina doctor who'd been told her accent was too difficult to understand. The thread once pulled kept unraveling. And amid this chaos, one unexpected figure emerged, Megan Hayes. Stripped of her job, shunned by her social circles, and haunted by headlines quoting her own words, she began showing up quietly at Compass Forward's weekly online sessions. She listened at first, then submitted questions, then joined a support group for former service workers confronting their past biases. One day she finally spoke. "I didn't just mess up," Megan said. "I inherited a culture where jokes like mine were normal, but I chose to repeat them. I laughed. I posted. I thought I was clever. And the worst part, I never stopped to ask who I was hurting." Others in the chat reacted with cautious respect. Some still scorned her. But Marjgery, reviewing the session transcript later, simply smiled a fraction. People don't change because they're told to. They change when the cost of not changing becomes clear. In her private journal that evening, she wrote just one sentence: "The same systems that devour their victims often feed on their enablers next." While the public shifted attention to new headlines and viral stories, Reed Global's legal team remained meticulous. A quiet audit reviewed every vendor, every affiliate, every third-party contractor. Those found complicit in silent prejudice were removed from partnership rosters. A new clause appeared in all Reed Global contracts. All partners must demonstrate active commitment to anti-discrimination policy with quarterly compliance checks. Silent complicity will be treated as breach of contract. Across the travel industry, that clause sent shivers. Airlines, airports, and service vendors scrambled to update their internal HR manuals. And back in San Francisco, in a quiet courtyard framed by olive trees and climbing jasmine, Marjgery Reed walked alone, tablet in hand. She reviewed client cases, upcoming board proposals, and messages from her team. Then she paused, staring at a single image, the boarding pass for seat 2A. The one they told her didn't belong to her. The one that started it all. She didn't delete it. She archived it. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder that even after years of power, influence, and success, dignity is still something you must sometimes defend, not by shouting, but by standing. Alone if you must, but never afraid. By the beginning of the next quarter, the damage was no longer hypothetical. It was measurable, documented, and irreversible. JFK International Airport's quarterly report showed a staggering 37% drop in premium bookings. ATL reported even worse. The sudden rerouting of Reed Global's top-tier clients to Denver and Miami had created ripple effects across every department. Executives who had once ignored memos about diversity training now scrambled to draft emergency reforms. But it was too late. Reed Global Travel wasn't just any vendor, it was the beating heart of the luxury business travel ecosystem. And now that heart had pulled its lifeblood elsewhere. On social media, Marjgery Reed remained silent. But silence didn't mean inaction. Behind closed doors in her San Francisco headquarters, she reviewed crisis management reports with her legal and strategy teams. They weren't just tracking losses. They were documenting proof. Emails from vendors, desperate offers from former airport partners, and most importantly, footage and screenshots that showed everything. Karen Smith's words, Tanya's dismissiveness, Megan's jokes, Chuck's smirks, Grant's disinterest, Ron's orchestration of the removal. Every actor in this humiliation had left behind a trail of receipts. Marjorie knew better than to seek revenge. She wasn't after retribution. She was after reform. But reform, she believed, only happens when the cost of staying the same becomes unbearable. And now the cost had become very clear. The Federal Aviation Administration launched a quiet inquiry into JFK's management policies after an anonymous tip, one of many quietly forwarded by Compass Forward volunteers, revealed long-standing biases in customer service evaluations. Meanwhile, at ATL, a class action lawsuit gained traction, led by a coalition of business travelers, many of them people of color, who had experienced eerily similar treatment. Though Marjorie wasn't directly involved, her name appeared in every article. She hadn't filed a lawsuit. She hadn't held a press conference. She hadn't posted a single tweet. But her presence loomed larger than any influencer or viral trend. She had become a symbol not of outrage, but of precision, of quiet resistance, of what happens when one woman documents every detail every time and knows exactly where to press. Meanwhile, Compass Forward's online sessions began to draw unexpected attention. HR departments from top airlines began signing up en masse. Universities requested curriculum access. Government agencies asked for consulting. One email even came from the CEO of a major competitor to Reed Global, Ms. Reed. Your organization represents not just dignity, but discipline. I am asking humbly that we speak. I want to learn before we are taught the hard way. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stared out her office window at the calm San Francisco skyline. A few blocks away, her granddaughter Simone was finishing her first year of law school. Simone had watched the incident unfold from afar, texting daily, ready to fly out if needed. But Marjgery had reassured her again and again, this fight is not about confrontation, it's about correction. That phrase, not confrontation, but correction, became the new motto of Compass Forward. It was printed on their brochures, embossed on office walls, and spoken aloud at every training session. And within JFK, it haunted the halls. Every staff meeting now opened with a stern reminder, any act of discrimination, bias, or silence in the face of injustice would be grounds for termination. And still, the airport's reputation struggled to recover. In staff rooms and private chats, former employees of JFK's check-in division began to open up. Some apologized. Others exposed systemic flaws that had been ignored for years. A former assistant manager confessed, we were told to prioritize appearance over protocol. They never put it in writing, but we all knew what it meant. Another former staffer added, we joked about passengers with accents, called them VIP wannabes. But now I realize we weren't protecting the system, we were corrupting it. At a closed-door aviation conference, JFK's director, Anderson Bell, delivered the most reluctant speech of his career. Looking weary and hollowed by weeks of damage control, he stood at the podium and addressed the packed hall. There is no excuse, he said flatly. No protocol, no policy, no technicality that justifies what happened to Ms. Reed. We failed not just her, but the very standards we claim to uphold. Let this be a line in the sand. Never again. His words circulated widely, dissected by news anchors and ethics experts. And while his remorse sounded genuine, no one missed the irony. The woman he apologized to would never hear it directly, because Marjgery didn't attend the conference. She didn't need to. Her presence had already reshaped the rules. Back in her office, Marjgery reviewed a final document, a comprehensive partnership reform package. Every airport, airline, and vendor seeking to renew their Reed Global contracts would have to submit to third-party oversight, agree to staff training on bias recognition, and maintain real-time monitoring of customer interactions. Not as punishment, but as protection. Protection for the future. For every older woman with silver hair and sharp eyes. For every customer told to weight an economy based on appearance. For every person with an accent dismissed before a word was even spoken. She tapped her pen once against the desk, then signed the package. The real consequences had only just begun. Weeks had passed since the shock wave known as Protocol D had gutted JFK and ATL's premium travel operations. Inside the sterile halls of both airports, you could still feel the residue of panic. But at Reed Global's headquarters, the air felt markedly different. Composed, focused, surgical. Marjgery Reed sat at the head of a walnut conference table surrounded by her executive team. No cameras, no grandstanding, just purpose. On the digital screen behind her, a map displayed clusters of high-value travel corridors, routes once dominated by JFK and ATL, now humming through new hubs, Denver, Miami, Houston, and LAX. Revenue had not decreased. It had redistributed. The same $950 million in international bookings now flowed through different ports channels that treated her company's clientele with the dignity they deserved. Reed Global had not just punished discrimination, it had bypassed it. And in doing so, it had created a blueprint others began to follow. As Marjgery reviewed the latest client satisfaction data, unprecedented, 98% approval across all diverted flights, her assistant entered with a leather folder. Letters from former partners, she said, laying them before her. One by one, Marjgery opened the envelopes. Apologies, pleas, promises. But none of them moved her. The letter from JFK's CEO was 3 pages long, handwritten in cursive, drenched in remorse. It mentioned everything from staff firings to internal reforms, but failed to mention what mattered most. It never once said her name. She closed the folder. Outside, the skyline of San Francisco shimmered under the noon sun. A subtle breeze stirred the red, white, and gold flags flying above Reed Global's courtyard. Marjgery didn't need headlines. She didn't need interviews. She'd already won in the one place it mattered most within the system that tried to erase her. But not everyone had moved on. That same day in a modest townhouse outside Queens, Megan Hayes stared blankly at her phone screen. Her bank account hovered dangerously near zero. Her inbox was flooded with rejections. A recruiter's latest reply was cold but clear. Given your recent public exposure and ethics concerns, we regret to inform you. Even Chuck Evans, once so sure of his position, had quietly relocated to Texas. Rumor had it he was working night shifts for a regional carrier, a far cry from the influence he once bragged about. Karen Smith had gone dark. No social media, no public statement, no new job. Tanya Bennett had fled the industry altogether. Her LinkedIn simply read, open to work, willing to relocate. And Ron Wallace, his fall had been the most ironic. Once the enforcer of systems and protocols, he now faced a lawsuit from a former employee who accused him of fostering a hostile, discriminatory work environment. The evidence screenshots from the same group chats that had once mocked Marjgery Reed. The reckoning had become permanent. Back in San Francisco, Compass Forward continued to grow. The nonprofit founded by Marjgery now trained thousands of staff annually on how to spot, stop, and reform institutional bias without waiting for a crisis to make it necessary. Airlines paid to send their teams. So did tech firms, universities, even police departments. And for every group trained, a portion of the proceeds went towards scholarships for women of color studying law, business, and social justice. It wasn't revenge, it was rebirth. One morning during Compass Forward's monthly open session, a familiar face walked in unannounced, hesitant, eyes heavy. Megan Hayes. She stood at the back, unsure if she'd be escorted out, but no one moved. After the session, as attendees mingled and sipped coffee, Megan approached a staff member and asked softly, would Ms. Reed ever consider speaking to me? The answer came not from the staffer, but from behind. I already am, Marjgery said gently. Megan turned stunned. There she was, poised, composed, as regal as ever. I came to say I'm sorry, Megan said, her voice cracking. I never understood how deep this went. What I said, what I did. It wasn't just a joke. It was part of something much darker. I know, Marjgery replied. And I'm glad you see it now." They stood in silence for a moment before Megan added, "I don't expect redemption. I just want to help make sure this never happens again." Marjgery nodded slowly. "Then let's begin." That day, Megan became Compass Forward's first ever fellowship trainee, learning, listening, and building what she once helped to break. It wasn't forgiveness. It was reconstruction. The same way airports were being rebuilt, the same way systems were being redesigned, not to elevate Marjgery Reed, but to ensure no one else like her would ever be dismissed so easily again. And as Reed Global's influence reshaped policies from coast to coast, from booking terminals to boardrooms, one thing became clear. Dignity didn't beg to be acknowledged. It documented, it strategized, and then with quiet authority, it commanded the world to listen. While headlines faded and public outrage began to shift elsewhere, the consequences of Reed Global's actions hadn't stopped. They had just moved behind closed doors. Inside JFK's upper-level executive suite, the mood was grim. Anderson Bell stood before a tense boardroom, his tie loosened, eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights. Every screen in the room displayed graphs with sharp red drops, revenue retention, investor confidence, all nosediving. "We lost Zurich," he began. A hush fell over the table. "In Singapore, Frankfurt, in Sao Paulo, all Reed Global elite programs withdrawn." Not paused, withdrawn. The chief financial officer spoke up, her tone clipped. "What about the internal audit?" Anderson hesitated. "Worse than expected. More employees than just the 5 named were involved. Dozens of chat logs, jokes, discriminatory nicknames. A culture of mocking non-white passengers. The bias wasn't a fluke, it was standard. The silence that followed was deafening. Across the city at a midtown Manhattan hotel, a crisis management firm was holding an emergency seminar on invisible bias and institutional collapse. The first slide read, "Case Study Reed Global versus JFK." Meanwhile, at ATL, the dominoes continued to fall. Their international terminal had become a ghost town. No Reed Global banners, no corporate groups in navy blazers, no multilingual greeters ushering high-value clients to VIP lounges. The blow wasn't just economic. It was symbolic. A system built to cater to elite travelers was suddenly forced to reckon with how it treated people who didn't look elite. And inside Reed Global, the mission was expanding. Under Marjgery Reed's direction, the company wasn't just withholding its partnerships. It was now funding a sweeping internal investigation of major travel hubs across the U.S., looking into similar patterns of customer mistreatment, algorithmic bias in seating assignments, and disciplinary cover-ups. They were gathering data, building a national report, and preparing to publish it under the banner, "The Quiet Gatekeepers: How Everyday Disrespect Becomes Structural Exclusion." Major airports began to panic. PR teams scrambled to update diversity statements. Staff manuals were rewritten. Sensitivity training became mandatory. Internal surveillance logs were reviewed for any signs of microaggressions. But it was too late. The spotlight was no longer external. It had been moved inward and it burned. Meanwhile, back at Compass Forward, the movement was taking root. Megan Hayes, now 6 weeks into her trainee rotation, had changed. Gone were the smirks, the careless, scrolling, the passive complicity. She listened more than she spoke. She stayed late to organize resources. And when she met families of people like Mrs. Reed, older professionals who'd faced similar treatment, she looked them in the eye and said, "I used to be part of the silence. Now I'm trying to be part of the voice." Across the globe, other CEOs took notice. The Reed Global Protocol had become a case study not just in crisis response, but in dignified resistance. A French luxury brand rewrote its travel policies after one of their black executives cited Reed's handling as the gold standard. A South Korean airline quietly reached out to Reed Global for private consultation on staff conduct reforms. And in Washington, a subcommittee on transportation ethics requested a briefing from Reed's legal team on industry-wide bias indicators. Marjgery, however, declined to attend. "I don't need to speak," she told her team. The numbers already do, but despite her absence, her name was on every page of the report circulated that week. Back at JFK, a new shift supervisor was quietly placed at the same check-in counter where it had all begun. Her name was Ayanna, young, sharp, and no stranger to being underestimated. She didn't replace the system. She represented what it could become. And on her first day, when an elderly black woman approached the counter with a printed first-class ticket, Ayanna didn't ask to see ID first. She smiled, looked the woman in the eye, and said, "Welcome, Ms. Thompson. We're honored to have you flying with us today." It was a small gesture, but in a world where silence once crushed dignity, even the softest words of respect echoed like thunder. And while most passengers walked past that moment without noticing, one elderly woman standing nearby did notice. She watched Ayanna closely, saw the sincerity in her tone and the absence of doubt in her face. She nodded quietly to herself, not because everything was fixed, but because the shift had finally begun. And high above, beyond the glass ceiling of the terminal, flights continued to depart. But this time, some were headed towards something better. By the time the boardrooms caught up, the world had already moved on, and it had moved without them. In the weeks that followed Reed Global's withdrawal from JFK and ATL, the landscape of global travel began shifting in ways few had anticipated. Travel analysts called it the Reed effect, an economic ripple born not from a lawsuit or a protest, but from the silent severing of a single thread of respect. First came the resignations. 3 senior vice presidents at JFK, including the director of international partnerships, quietly stepped down. No statements were issued, no interviews granted, just short press releases citing health or personal reasons. Then came the audits. Internal reviews spread like wildfire across other hubs: Chicago O'Hare, LAX, Dallas, Fort Worth, each unearthing unsettling truths. Algorithms that disproportionately reassigned minority passengers from premium to economy. Staff WhatsApp groups full of mocking emojis and unprofessional commentary. Glaring disparities in complaint resolutions. Suddenly, no one wanted to be the next JFK. Major carriers scrambled to insulate themselves. Diversity boards were restructured. Third-party vendors reassessed their client-facing staff. Internal memos circulated instructing employees to review the Reed Global briefing before every shift, an unprecedented move for a private company with no governmental enforcement behind it. But Reed Global wasn't finished. Behind closed doors, Marjgery's legal and ethics teams continued building what they now called the Equity Standards Index, a universal rating scale for airlines, airports, and corporate hospitality brands based on how they treated every passenger, not just those with platinum cards. The news broke on a Tuesday morning. CNBC ran the headline first: Reed Global Travel launches industry-wide accountability index. Vendors to be rated on equity, not exclusivity. By noon, airports in Zurich, Tokyo, and Johannesburg requested briefings. Airline CEOs from 3 continents placed quiet calls to Reed's head of strategic partnerships. Some were defensive, others desperate to adapt. But none could ignore the shift. Meanwhile, Compass Forward, once just a small nonprofit tucked under the wing of Reed Global, expanded its operations tenfold. With new funding, they began deploying training modules across industries, not just aviation, but hotels, cruise lines, and even corporate HR departments. Megan Hayes, the former JFK employee, stood before a room of travel trainees in Dallas. Her voice steady. "I used to be the person on the other side of the counter," she said. "I thought politeness could cover up cruelty. I was wrong. What happened at JFK wasn't just a moment, it was a mirror. And it showed me what I'd become." The audience was silent. A young intern raised her hand. "Do you think people can really change after something like that?" Megan didn't hesitate. Yes, but only if they were willing to listen. Back at Reed Global's Los Angeles headquarters, Marjgery watched the session replay through a secure stream. She didn't smile, but she did nod once, quietly, not out of pride, but recognition. Real change doesn't erupt. It accumulates quietly, persistently, until it can no longer be ignored. Outside her office window, the California sun traced long shadows across the glass. The world beyond kept spinning. But somewhere in the airways above the balance of dignity and silence had shifted. Even at JFK, subtle signs of transformation had taken root. Passenger advocacy booths appeared at terminals that had once ignored complaints. Anonymous reporting kiosks were installed near security gates. Staff huddles now began with a pledge. Every traveler deserves dignity. Every shift is a new chance to uphold it. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was happening because one woman had refused to be erased. Marjgery Reed, the Black CEO, they once mocked for her accent and dismissed as a slow old lady, had not only reclaimed her seat, she had redrawn the blueprint of the system that tried to strip it from her. The airport that had cast her aside now taught her methods. The staff who once jeered now studied her protocols. And the companies that once saw her as just another customer now structured their entire reputations around not making the same mistake again. Not because they feared her power, but because they finally understood it. And so while travelers continued to pass through terminals unaware, a legacy rooted in silence and forged in precision grew stronger every day. Weeks turned into months. The headlines faded. Airports resumed their rhythms. New staff were hired, terminals renovated, and press cycles spun forward with fresh stories. But within every departure gate, in every hushed first-class lounge, something unspoken had changed. It wasn't policy manuals or posters on equity. It wasn't even the sweeping staff firings or the plummeting revenue charts. It was fear, but not the fear of punishment. It was the fear of being seen, truly seen, for who you are when no one's watching. In boardrooms, directors still whispered about Protocol D like it was corporate folklore. Mid-level managers brought up Marjgery Reed's name in onboarding presentations. She changed everything without ever raising her voice. Her story was shared not as a warning, but as a lesson in restraint, grace, and unflinching accountability. And still, Marjgery remained silent. She didn't appear on panels. She never gave an interview. She declined every podcast feature story and TV exclusive. While others clamored for influence, she understood that the loudest echoes come not from shouting, but from presence. Instead, she worked. At Reed Global, she built the Compass Alliance, a coalition of private firms, logistics companies, airlines, hotels, even cruise operators, committed to rewriting the ethical standards of travel, not just for the elite, but for everyone. The Compass Charter signed under her leadership declared, dignity is not an upgrade, respect is not a reward. They are non-negotiables. It was the first time in the industry's history that vendors were rated not on speed or luxury, but on fairness. Her firm launched new platforms where travelers could log microaggressions as easily as delays. They partnered with whistleblower networks, funded legal defense for mistreated passengers, and implemented hidden audits that monitored frontline conduct globally. And yet, for all this systemic change, Marjgery still took the same flights, dragged the same leather suitcase, and wore the same navy coat. She moved through the world as she always had, quietly, attentively. But now eyes followed her with recognition. Sometimes an airline rep would quietly offer her a handwritten apology long after the scandal had cooled. Sometimes younger employees would pause to thank her voice shaking for giving them permission to speak up when they saw injustice. And every so often, an older woman, often Black, sometimes Asian, sometimes just invisible in the eyes of the world, would walk past her and nod. Nothing was said, but everything was understood. One such afternoon in the International Lounge of Lisbon's Humberto Delgado Airport, a young mixed-race woman approached her table. She was in uniform, aviation staff, barely out of college. She carried herself nervously. "Mrs. Reed," she said, voice barely above a whisper, "I work for a small carrier. We're implementing your training program." Marjgery smiled gently. "How's it going?" The young woman hesitated, then beamed. "It's hard. but worth it. People are listening now for the first time. Marjorie nodded. Then it's working. And that was it. No photo, no press, just a transfer of legacy from one quiet fire starter to another. Back home in Atlanta, in the quiet study of her family estate, Marjorie often sat at a cedarwood desk writing by hand in her ledger. Her notes were not for memoirs. She didn't care for legacy in the way the world measured it. She wrote because she knew memory was the most powerful weapon silence could carry. One evening, her niece, now COO of Reed Global, found a note paperclipped to an old case file. It read, "When a system erases you in silence, don't scream. Let your silence become a storm they cannot ignore." She framed it and placed it in the Compass Forward headquarters. It remains there today. The JFK incident never made it into mainstream history books. But inside corporate ethics training, aviation law programs, and human rights symposiums, it became case study 11A, the Reed Protocol. In its wake, thousands of frontline employees were trained in dignity-first service. Algorithms were rewritten to flag bias. Anonymous customer feedback became standard. And most importantly, passengers began to notice each other again. To look, to speak up, not always, but enough. And all because one woman refused to let her humanity be downgraded. Marjgery Reed didn't bring down the system with noise. She reprogrammed it with silence. A silence sharpened by experience. A silence that didn't demand but expected justice. That didn't rage but rebuilt. She became a myth to some, a role model to others, but to those who carry her torch. She is a reminder of something more important than fame or revenge. Dignity is invincible when worn with patience. And even in the loudest terminal, justice can move without sound. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to catch more gripping stories like this. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.